Well, that's it.
That's what?
What's the idea?
What's the big idea?
What's the big idea? What's the big idea, egghead? What's the big idea? Come on.
Say, what's the idea?
What's the idea of pulling me off the horse? What's the idea of coming out so quick? What's the idea of taking the ladder away?
What's the idea of kicking me?
What's the idea of pushing my face in the paint?
Hey, what's the big idea?
What's the big idea? What's the idea? Stop tickling my foot.
Oh, you said a nasty word.
What's the idea?
What's the idea of crossing us up? What's the idea of spoiling the game?
Hey, what's the idea?
What's the idea?
What's the idea? What's the idea of shelling me?
What's the idea? Get back there.
What's the big idea? What's the idea? I was just about to play Coming Through the Corn.
What's the idea?
What's the idea of taking so long?
I filed Smith's toupee under D.
What's the idea of filing it under D?
It had dandruff.
What's the idea?
What's the idea of wasting your time on junk like that?
What's the idea of sponging on me?
What's the idea of the rifle? What's the idea of tearing that turkey apart?
What's the idea?
Say, what's the idea of all the clocks?
What's the idea of the 3 watches? What's the idea of going to bed with your clothes on? What's the idea of not waiting for me?
What's the idea of hitting me on the head?
Uh-oh.
What's the idea?
What's the idea?
What's the idea?
What's the idea?
What's the idea, flat top? Hey, what's the idea of kicking me?
Oh!
What's the idea?
What's the idea? You think you're in California? What's the idea of eating with your knife?
What's the idea? Give me that key. Hey, what's the idea?
What's the big idea?
What's the idea of stalling? What's the idea of kicking me, you backbiter?
What's the idea?
What's the idea of slapping?
What am I gonna do now?
What's the idea of throwing dirty ashes on a nice clean floor?
What's the idea?
You put in too much. Oh! What's the idea of hitting me with that pestle? You're lucky I didn't hit you with a mortar.
The more the merrier.
Quiet.
Oh! Put that pestle down, man.